Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever walked into a place and felt that instant chill? That unsettling sense that something isn't quite right, even when everything seems normal? I had always thought it was just my overactive imagination, a byproduct of growing up in a small town where rumors and ghost stories filled the air. But when we moved into the old house on Elm Street, I began to wonder if I was wrong. We were a typical family, my wife, Emma, our daughter, Lily, and me. After a rough couple of years, with a job loss and some personal struggles, this house was supposed to be a fresh start. The realtor had called it a charming old place, a bit worn, but perfect for a family like ours. A quiet neighborhood, good schools for Lily, and a house with a lot of character. It seemed like the right choice. The moment we stepped inside, I felt it. That unease that I couldn't shake off. It was subtle, almost like an electric hum in the air. Maybe it was the way the floor creaked under my feet or the way the rooms seemed to stretch on endlessly, each corner darker than the last. Emma was excited, though. She was always the optimist, the one who saw the potential in everything. "This place is perfect," she'd said, a smile on her face as she unpacked boxes. But I couldn't ignore the way the air felt heavy, like it was thick with memories I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. The house had a history, one that I hadn't yet discovered, and for some reason, it seemed to have started watching me as soon as we arrived. It was the small things at first. A sound, faint and barely noticeable. The creak of a door in the middle of the night. A whisper that didn't quite reach my ears, but felt more like a presence in the air. I told myself it was just the house settling, just the wind moving through the old walls. But one evening, as I was unpacking in the basement, I found something strange. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a small, dusty box. I opened it, half expecting old tools or forgotten papers. Instead, there was a collection of old photographs, the edges yellowed with age. Faces I didn't recognize stared back at me. But it wasn't the faces that disturbed me, it was the eyes. They weren't normal eyes. They seemed too dark, too hollow, like they were hiding something. And then there was the smell. At first, I thought it was just mildew from the old wood. But over the next few days, it grew stronger, almost unbearable. It was a mix of something rancid, like spoiled food, and something more metallic, like blood. The smell lingered in the hallways, no matter how much we cleaned. Emma noticed it too, but she chalked it up to the house's age, a result of years of neglect. But the longer I stayed in this place, the more I realized there was something wrong. Something in the house wasn't ready to let us go. It was one evening, late after dinner, that I heard it again. That sound. A slow, dragging footstep, followed by a soft scrape, like nails against wood. I froze, looking at Emma and Lily. They hadn't heard it, or at least, they hadn't acknowledged it. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Emma replied, a smile on her face as she turned to me, holding a book in her hands. "It's just the house settling." But I wasn't convinced. I stood in the doorway for a few moments, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Instead, the house fell back into an eerie silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong. Like everything is holding its breath, waiting. I wanted to ignore it, to dismiss it as nothing, but deep down, I knew something was happening here. Something I couldn't explain. As the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, watching us, waiting. And when I closed my eyes to sleep, I couldn't help but feel like the shadows were moving, like they were whispering my name. I didn't tell Emma. I didn't want to worry her, but I knew I had to find out what was happening in this house. It was like it had some kind of secret, and I had to uncover it. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face what I would find, but I couldn't turn away. The next day, I began searching. I went through the attic, the basement, and every room in the house, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. It was there, in the attic, behind an old trunk, that I found something else. A door hidden behind the layers of dust and cobwebs. A door that wasn't on the original blueprints. I opened it slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and what I found on the other side made my blood run cold. It was another room untouched by time. Old furniture, covered in white sheets, sat in the corners. And in the center of the room, on the floor, was an old rug. But what caught my attention was the pattern, an intricate design that seemed almost alive, shifting under my gaze. I bent down to take a closer look, and that's when I saw it. A footprint, fresh and dark, in the center of the rug. It was as though something, had just been standing there. I stood there, staring at the print, my heart racing. This wasn't just my imagination anymore. Something was in this house. Something was waiting for me. And it wasn't going to let me leave. I stood there, frozen, staring at that footprint in the center of the rug. It wasn't just the shape that unnerved me, it was the sensation that came with it. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. Who had been here? Why was there a footprint on this rug, fresh, as if someone had just stepped on it moments ago? I took a slow, careful step back, my gaze never leaving the mark. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. The house felt like it was closing in on me. I looked around the room, hoping to find some explanation, something that could convince me that this was all just a trick of the mind, but there was nothing. Just the same old furniture, covered in dust and age, and the eerie rug with a pattern that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. I reached out and touched the rug, my fingers trembling as I brushed the edge. The fabric was cold. Too cold for something that was so old. I quickly pulled my hand away, a chill running through me. Stay calm, I whispered to myself, trying to steady my breath. It's just a footprint. Someone could have come in and left it here. Maybe the previous owners. But the words felt hollow, even to me. I turned toward the attic stairs, knowing I couldn't stay in this room any longer. I needed answers. I had to know what was leaving these signs behind. I could feel my anxiety building, that gnawing sense that I was being watched. It was like I wasn't alone in the house, even though I knew Emma and Lily were downstairs. I moved quickly down the stairs, my feet echoing against the old wooden steps. The house felt different now, colder. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me around every corner, that there were eyes watching my every move. I found Emma in the kitchen, preparing dinner, humming softly to herself as she chopped vegetables. Lily was sitting at the table, sketching something in her notebook. The sight of them both brought me some comfort, but it was fleeting. My mind kept drifting back to the attic and the footprint. "Everything okay?" Emma asked, glancing up as I entered. I nodded, but the lie tasted bitter on my tongue. Yeah, just exploring a bit more. You know, checking out the place. Emma smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. You've been acting a little strange ever since we moved in. Are you sure you're all right? I'm fine, I said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Just tired. I'll be okay. She didn't seem convinced, but she let it go, turning back to her cooking. Lily didn't look up from her drawing, her pencil moving swiftly across the paper. But something about her silence seemed off, as if she, too, felt the strange tension that had settled over the house. As the evening wore on, the sense of unease grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, as though I expected to see someone standing there, watching me. But whenever I turned, there was nothing. Just the shadows that stretched long across the walls. Later that night, when we were all settled in bed, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Emma's breathing was steady beside me, but mine was quick and shallow. Every creak of the house, every shift in the air, made me tense. The room felt too quiet, as though the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to the attic, to that room with the rug and the footprint. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand it. But I knew one thing for sure, there was something in this house. And it wasn't going to let me rest until I uncovered its secrets. I got up quietly, careful not to disturb Emma, and made my way to the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. I moved silently through the hall, past the bedrooms, down the stairs, and back to the attic. The door was still ajar, just as I had left it. The air in the attic was colder now, the silence even more oppressive. I stepped inside, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. The room looked the same, but something had shifted. The rug was no longer exactly where I had left it. It had moved, just slightly, as though someone had nudged it while I wasn't looking. I bent down again to examine the spot where I had seen the footprint. The mark was still there, but now it seemed even darker, more pronounced. It was almost as though it was wet. I reached down, my hand trembling as I touched the floor around it. My fingers brushed something cold, something slick. I pulled my hand back quickly, a gasp escaping my lips. There was something on the floor. A trail of dark, sticky substance that led from the rug toward the far corner of the room. I followed the trail with my eyes, my body rigid with fear. The darkness in the corner seemed to stretch further than it should have, as if it was consuming the very light around it. There was something in that corner, something moving. A figure. Or was it just a shadow? I couldn't tell. The darkness shifted again, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, someone standing there, watching me. I froze, unable to move. The air grew colder still, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The house was no longer just a house. It was something alive, something watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The room fell back into its oppressive silence. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But something kept me rooted to the spot. The house was playing with me, I realized. It was drawing me in, pushing me further into its dark secrets until I had no choice but to uncover them. I turned slowly, my feet heavy as I backed toward the door. I had to get out of here. I had to get away from whatever was haunting this place. But before I could reach the stairs, I heard it again. A sound, soft at first, like a whisper. But then it grew louder, sharper. My name, my voice, calling me. I froze. It wasn't Emma. It wasn't Lily. The house itself was calling my name. The sound of my name lingered in the cold air, reverberating through the attic. It wasn't just a whisper, it was clear, distinct, and full of intent. A part of me wanted to believe it was my mind playing tricks on me, a manifestation of my own fear. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It wasn't just in my head. It was real. The house was alive with something that was reaching out to me, calling me closer. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body tensed. The darkness in the corner seemed to grow, the air around me thickening, almost suffocating. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath, white and misty in the dim light. The whisper turned into a soft laugh, a hollow, unsettling sound that echoed through the room. I spun around, scanning the attic, hoping to find some rational explanation. But the space remained empty. The shadows, however, seemed to stretch unnaturally long, curling and writhing like they were alive. I could hear the faint rustle of something moving in the darkness, but when I looked, nothing was there. Get it together, I muttered to myself, trying to ground myself in the present. My heart was racing, my breathing erratic, but I couldn't let the fear take control. I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to know what this house wanted from me. I took a shaky step forward, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and the floor creaked beneath me. My eyes were drawn once more to the corner, to the shifting shadows. I forced myself to approach, each step heavier than the last. The air felt thick with an electric charge, like the atmosphere itself was charged with dread. I reached the corner, my breath shallow and rapid. It felt as if something was watching me from within the dark, waiting, expecting. I glanced around nervously before my gaze fixed on the floor. There, on the wooden boards, was the dark stain. It was no longer just a faint trail, it had spread, blotting out the light in certain spots, forming a strange, abstract pattern that seemed almost purposeful. A low groan echoed from deep within the walls, making my skin prickle with unease. The sound reverberated through the house, as though the very foundation of the building was moaning in pain. The stain on the floor seemed to pulse in response, as if the house itself was breathing, alive. The whispering returned, but this time it wasn't just my name. It was a phrase, faint and distant, like a voice from the past. Leave, now, before it comes. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My pulse quickened, and my hands began to tremble. I didn't know if I should run or stay. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to leave this place behind, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity, or maybe something darker, compelled me to stay, to uncover whatever secrets this house was hiding. I crouched down, my knees creaking as I bent over the stain on the floor. My fingers hovered above it, afraid to touch it, but drawn to it nonetheless. The scent in the air had changed, growing sharper, more metallic. The smell of old blood, of something unnatural, clung to the air, filling my nostrils with a sickening familiarity. I hesitated for a moment, then placed my hand on the floor. The coldness of the surface sent a jolt through me, but I couldn't pull away. My fingers sank into the dark liquid. No, it wasn't liquid, it was more like ink. Thick, black ink, as if the very walls of the house were bleeding. The moment my hand made contact, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. The whispering escalated, turning into frantic, indistinct mutterings, like voices all around me, from every direction, pressing in on me. The shadows seemed to writhe, swirling, distorting. Then, I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, a shape, humanoid in form but distorted, elongated, like a silhouette stretched too far. Its features were obscured, but there was no mistaking the presence of something wrong. The air around me grew colder still, and I could feel the pressure on my chest, as though the figure was suffocating me, drawing the very air from my lungs. My heart pounded in my ears as I tried to back away, but my body refused to move. The figure was getting closer, its form blurring in and out of focus, like it was shifting between dimensions. The whispers grew louder, now forming words that I could understand. "Leave this place," it hissed, its voice like nails scraping against a chalkboard. "You shouldn't have come." I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me. I hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of me. Panic seized me, flooding my chest, and I gasped for air. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes locked on the figure, still hovering in the corner, watching me. I had to get out. I had to leave this house, this nightmare, before it consumed me entirely. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my feet pounding against the wooden floor, my pulse racing in my throat. The house seemed to groan beneath me, the floorboards shifting as if the entire structure was shifting, ready to collapse. The whispering followed me, relentless, growing louder, closer. Too late. I reached the attic door, slamming it shut behind me, but the whispering didn't stop. It was in my head now, echoing with every heartbeat. I ran down the hallway, back toward the stairs, desperate to reach the front door. But as I descended the stairs, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The door to the outside was wide open, the wind howling through the cracked wood. The air felt wrong, heavy, like it was pushing against me. I looked out into the yard, but what I saw sent a shock of terror straight through me. Figures. Dozens of them. Standing in the yard, facing the house. And they were all looking at me. I froze. The shadows on the porch seemed to move, twisting, curling. The house had already claimed me. There was no escape. Not anymore. "Leave, now," I heard again, only this time it was not just the house. It was the figures outside, speaking as one, their voices blending with the whisper of the house. I took a step back, heart hammering in my chest. The figures began to move toward the house. I didn't have much time. I couldn't breathe. The figures outside the house were getting closer, slowly, deliberately, like they had all the time in the world. They were silent, but their presence was deafening. The air felt thick, suffocating. My chest constricted, and I could feel the weight of their gaze pressing against me, even though I couldn't make out their faces. There was something wrong with them. They were not human. I didn't know what they were, but I knew they were not supposed to be there. I stumbled back, my legs shaky, my mind racing. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. But my feet felt like lead, and the door was still wide open, the wind howling through the cracks, carrying with it the scent of decay. A cold, damp smell that made my stomach turn. The whispering was growing louder now, a chorus of voices from inside the house. It wasn't just one voice anymore. They were all speaking in unison, and the words they spoke, no, the words they demanded, were clear and full of malice. "Leave the house. Leave it now, or it will claim you too." My heart hammered in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I backed away from the door, stumbling over my own feet. The figures outside were still coming. Slowly. Relentlessly. They had no urgency, no need to rush. It was like they were certain. certain that I couldn't escape. I turned, running back through the hallway, my fingers brushing the walls as I tried to keep my bearings. The house felt like it was shifting, warping as I moved. The once familiar walls were now closing in on me, their angles twisted, their surfaces warped in ways that didn't make sense. It was like the house itself was alive, suffocating me, urging me to stay in place, to face whatever it was that had been waiting for me. I made it to the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath my weight. My legs felt like jelly, each step a battle to stay upright. The door to the basement was open, the dark stairs leading down into a pit of nothingness. I glanced at the door, and for a moment, I considered it. Maybe, just maybe, there was something down there. Something that could help me. But then I saw it. In the corner of my eye. A shadow. It was too quick to catch in full, but I knew it wasn't just a trick of the light. It wasn't just my mind playing games. The shadow was moving, slithering, crawling up the stairs. I didn't wait. I couldn't wait. I bolted toward the front door again, but just as my fingers brushed the cold handle, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, echoing in the silence of the house. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. I pushed the door open, the wind biting at my skin as I stepped into the yard. The figures were there, still standing, but now they were closer. So close I could almost feel their presence, like an invisible weight pressing against my chest. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the gate, my mind a blur of panic and confusion. But as I reached for the gate, I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A voice. Clear and unmistakable. You can't leave. I turned, my heart freezing in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. The figures, now no longer just shadows, but things, had moved forward, blocking my path. Their faces were still obscured, but there was something about the way they stood, about the way their bodies shifted in the dim light, that sent a shiver down my spine. They were waiting, watching me. I took a step back, my mind screaming for me to run, but my body refused to move. The door to the house slammed shut with a deafening bang, making me jump. I spun around, but the house, it had changed. The once familiar exterior was now dark, twisted, distorted. The windows were blackened, like eyes staring into my soul. Too late. I reached the attic door, slamming it shut behind me, but the whispering didn't stop. It was in my head now, echoing with every heartbeat. I ran down the hallway, back toward the stairs, desperate to reach the front door. But as I descended the stairs, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The door to the outside was wide open, the wind howling through the cracked wood. The air felt wrong, heavy, like it was pushing against me. I looked out into the yard, but what I saw sent a shock of terror straight through me. Figures. Dozens of them. Standing in the yard, facing the house. And they were all looking at me. I froze. The shadows on the porch seemed to move, twisting, curling. The house had already claimed me. There was no escape. Not anymore. Leave, now, I heard again, only this time it was not just the house. It was the figures outside, speaking as one, their voices blending with the whisper of the house. I took a step back, heart hammering in my chest. The figures began to move toward the house. I didn't have much time. I couldn't breathe. The figures outside the house were getting closer, slowly, deliberately, like they had all the time in the world. They were silent, but their presence was deafening. The air felt thick, suffocating. My chest constricted, and I could feel the weight of their gaze pressing against me, even though I couldn't make out their faces. There was something wrong with them. They were not human. I didn't know what they were, but I knew they were not supposed to be there. I stumbled back, my legs shaky, my mind racing. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. But my feet felt like lead, and the door was still wide open, the wind howling through the cracks, carrying with it the scent of decay. A cold, damp smell that made my stomach turn. The whispering was growing louder now, a chorus of voices from inside the house. It wasn't just one voice anymore. They were all speaking in unison, and the words they spoke, no, the words they demanded, were clear and full of malice. Leave the house. Leave it now, or it will claim you too. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I backed away from the door, stumbling over my own feet. The figures outside were still coming. Slowly. Relentlessly. They had no urgency, no need to rush. It was like they were certain that I couldn't escape. I turned, running back through the hallway, my fingers brushing the walls as I tried to keep my bearings. The house felt like it was shifting, warping as I moved. The once familiar walls were now closing in on me, their angles twisted, their surfaces warped in ways that didn't make sense. It was like the house itself was alive, suffocating me, urging me to stay in place, to face whatever it was that had been waiting for me. I made it to the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath my weight. My legs felt like jelly, each step a battle to stay upright. The door to the basement was open, the dark stairs leading down into a pit of nothingness. I glanced at the door, and for a moment, I considered it. Maybe, just maybe, there was something down there. Something that could help me. But then I saw it. In the corner of my eye. A shadow. It was too quick to catch in full, but I knew it wasn't just a trick of the light. It wasn't just my mind playing games. The shadow was moving, slithering, crawling up the stairs. I didn't wait. I couldn't wait. I bolted toward the front door again, but just as my fingers brushed the cold handle, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, echoing in the silence of the house. I didn't turn to look. I couldn't. I pushed the door open, the wind biting at my skin as I stepped into the yard. The figures were there, still standing, but now they were closer. So close I could almost feel their presence, like an invisible weight pressing against my chest. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the gate, my mind a blur of panic and confusion. But as I reached for the gate, I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A voice. Clear and unmistakable. You can't leave. I turned, my heart freezing in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. The figures, now no longer just shadows, but things, had moved forward, blocking my path. Their faces were still obscured, but there was something about the way they stood, about the way their bodies shifted in the dim light, that sent a shiver down my spine. They were waiting, watching me. I took a step back, my mind screaming for me to run, but my body refused to move. The door to the house slammed shut with a deafening bang, making me jump. I spun around, but the house, it had changed. The once familiar exterior was now dark, twisted, distorted. The windows were blackened, like eyes staring into my soul. The whispering started again, but this time it was not from inside the house. It was coming from the figures, their mouths moving in unison as they spoke in a language I couldn't understand. The sound was guttural, like an animalistic chant that resonated deep in my bones. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. There was no sound, no escape. And then it happened. The ground beneath my feet began to shake. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the very earth was alive, trembling in fear. The wind picked up, howling, tearing at the trees around me. The figures moved closer, their footsteps no longer silent, but loud, booming, like the march of something ancient, something predatory. I had to run. I turned and sprinted toward the woods, my legs pumping with desperation. I could hear the footsteps behind me, too close now, too fast. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, making every step feel like I was sinking into the earth. The trees around me blurred, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, trying to grab me, to hold me back. I glanced over my shoulder, but the figures were gone. For a moment, I thought I might be free. But then I felt it. A sharp tug at my arm, as if something invisible had grabbed hold of me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The world around me was shifting, warping again, the trees stretching and bending unnaturally. I looked up. There was no sky anymore. Only darkness. Endless, suffocating darkness. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But it was. The world was changing, and I was no longer sure where the boundaries of the house ended and the outside world began. Then, in the distance, I saw something. A flicker of light. A faint glow that seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat. It was coming from the house. It was calling me. And despite everything, despite the fear gnawing in my insides, despite the voice in my head screaming at me to run, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't escape. The house had claimed me. And now, it was waiting for me to return. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that it drowned out all other sounds, the rush of blood in my ears a constant reminder of how close the end was. The faint glow from the house pulsed like a beacon, calling to me, beckoning me toward it, but every instinct in my body screamed to run in the opposite direction. Yet my legs were heavy, as if something invisible was weighing me down, chaining me to this cursed place. I took a hesitant step forward, my breath shallow, as I tried to shake off the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare. The ground beneath me seemed to buckle with each movement, as if the earth itself was shifting, twisting, ready to swallow me whole. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root that had appeared out of nowhere, sending me sprawling onto the cold, damp soil. As I pushed myself to my feet, I looked around in a panic. The trees that once stood tall and proud were now twisted forms, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands. The sky had turned an unnatural shade of black, no stars, no moon, just the suffocating, oppressive darkness that seemed to stretch forever. And still, that light in the distance, the glow from the house, was there, pulling me toward it like a magnetic force. But I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to face whatever was waiting for me in that house. I turned away, running again, forcing my legs to move, pushing my body to ignore the pain that shot through me with each step. But the path ahead was no better. The woods had become a maze, each tree looking the same as the last, each turn leading me deeper into the heart of this nightmare. I tried to focus, to steady my breath, but the closer I got to the house, the more I could feel its presence, like a shadow, stretching, enveloping everything in its path. And then, the whispering started again. Low at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but then louder, clearer. It was coming from behind me, from within the very trees themselves. A dozen voices, no, hundreds, all speaking in unison. Their words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, dark, ominous, full of warning. You cannot outrun it. I froze. My stomach dropped, and the cold that had been creeping up my spine turned to ice. The trees around me swayed, not from the wind, but from some unseen force, some presence that was alive, that was aware of me. I felt a hand brush the back of my neck, icy cold, sending shivers through my entire body. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness. Just the whispering. It was getting closer. I turned back toward the house, the glow now brighter, more urgent. The door was open, standing wide, an invitation, or was it a trap? I didn't know. All I knew was that I had no choice. The house was drawing me in, and no matter how hard I tried to resist, I could feel my feet moving in its direction. I didn't even see the figure standing in the doorway at first. It was only when I reached the threshold that I saw it, a silhouette, standing in the shadows, waiting. The figure was tall, impossibly so, its features hidden by the darkness, but there was something about it that made my stomach churn. It was like I could feel its presence in the very air around me. Come inside, the voice said, a cold whisper that sent tremors down my spine. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, and my legs felt like lead. The figure's voice was familiar, but it wasn't. It was twisted, distorted, as if something had corrupted it. It wasn't human. You're too late to escape, it continued, stepping forward, the shadows stretching around it like a living thing. It was impossibly tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally long. The darkness around it seemed to bend, to shift with its movements. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in this moment, this thing, this presence that seemed to be draining all the energy from my body. My limbs felt heavy, my mind was foggy. Every instinct screamed at me to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The figure stepped closer. I could feel its cold breath against my face now, as if it were inside my very soul. It wasn't just in front of me, it was inside of me. I could hear its thoughts, twisted and malevolent, echoing in my mind. You thought you could run, didn't you? You thought you could escape this place. But you were already part of it. You always have been. I gasped, the words hitting me like a physical blow. I tried to pull away, but my body refused to move. I felt the darkness closing in around me, suffocating me, smothering me in its cold embrace. The figure reached out, its long, skeletal fingers grazing my cheek. There is no escaping the house. The words reverberated in my head, like a curse, like a promise. I could feel my sanity slipping away, unraveling, as the house itself seemed to breathe with me, its walls shifting, closing in. It was alive, and it had claimed me. There was no escape. I was already trapped, and I had been from the moment I stepped inside. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face. But then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the world went still. I opened my eyes. The figure was gone. The house was silent. And for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But when I looked down at my hands, they were cold, pale, as if the life had been drained from them. I wasn't free. I was part of it now, and there was no turning back. The question was simple. Where did they go? 6 disappearances in the past 3 months. No bodies, no traces, just empty apartments, abandoned cars, and frantic, unanswered calls. The city was used to its usual crime and chaos, but this was different. This felt personal. I hadn't believed in ghosts, not truly. Not since I lost my sister, Lila, to a car accident 10 years ago. It wasn't that I didn't feel her absence, that I didn't wish I could hear her voice again. But I was a journalist, a man of facts, of logic, and facts didn't have room for the paranormal. But even so, when the first person disappeared, when Lena Fairchild, a young teacher, was found missing, just vanished one quiet night in her own home, I couldn't ignore it. There was something eerie about it. It wasn't just a disappearance. There was something wrong, a thread pulling in my chest, gnawing at my sense of reason. The police said she was probably dead, that she might have fled in a fit of madness. They had no leads, no suspects, just empty streets. But something told me it was more than that. More than a simple vanishing act. Lena Fairchild was a rational woman. No history of mental illness, no deaths, no enemies. Yet she was gone, just like the others who had disappeared since. I, Daniel Kessler, a once promising reporter now relegated to covering local stories, was intrigued. And that was the problem. Intrigue was dangerous, especially when it led you down dark, twisting paths. Paths that were lined with uncertainty and shadows. The legend of the urban haunting was whispered between those who'd lived in this city long enough to remember. A tale that grew in the telling, each retelling adding another layer of mystery, another shred of doubt. People didn't speak about it openly, of course, no one ever did, not if they wanted to keep their jobs or their sanity. But everyone knew the story. The tale of the ghostly figure that haunted the alleyways at night. A figure that had been seen by many, but never caught. It had a name, the Phantom Walker, the urban haunting, the thing that stalked the city streets in the dead of night. But was it real? I stood at the corner of 3rd Street and Linden Avenue, the faint hum of the city surrounding me. The traffic noise. The voices of people heading home after a long day of work. The aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart wafted through the air, blending with the cold scent of wet concrete from the recent rain. There was nothing unusual about this place. It was ordinary. Too ordinary. But the more I looked at the buildings, the more the feeling grew there was something else here. Something hiding in the shadows, watching from the windows. A presence I couldn't place but couldn't escape. My fingers trembled as I held up my camera, trying to snap pictures of the area. My instinct screamed at me to go home, to drop the case, but the flickering light above me, the one that seemed to blink in sync with the pounding of my pulse, kept me rooted to the spot. I had been investigating this for a week now, talking to locals, following up on police reports, interviewing family members of the missing. Each new conversation led to more questions than answers. The missing were all linked by one thing: they had all disappeared on the same street. 3rd Street. There was no concrete connection, no logical reason why this one part of the city had become a vortex of disappearances. It was an anomaly. I wasn't the only one feeling it. A police officer I had interviewed had confided in me late one night. "I don't know how to explain it," he'd said, "but I feel like we're being watched. Like, there's something out there." He had said it so quietly, so casually, that I thought I'd imagined it. But I hadn't. The other officers dismissed his concerns as paranoia, but I could tell he was troubled. Something had unnerved him, and I was beginning to understand why. The more I dug, the more I realized that there were patterns in the disappearances. All of them had occurred after dark. All of them had been alone, walking down 3rd Street. It wasn't the kind of pattern that made sense. It wasn't criminal, at least not in the way I had initially thought. I had to find out more. I decided to return to Lena Fairchild's apartment building. The landlord had been kind enough to let me in, and the apartment was exactly as Lena had left it, except for the eerie quiet that filled every corner, every inch of the empty space. Her belongings were untouched. Her desk still held the books she used to grade her students. Her kitchen was clean. Nothing seemed amiss except for her absence. The landlord had mentioned strange sounds that were often heard late at night. Footsteps. But no one ever saw anyone. The halls were always empty, save for the occasional tenant coming home. I felt a cold draft rush across the back of my neck as I walked through the narrow hallways, my footsteps echoing in the silence. It felt like I wasn't alone. And that's when I heard it. A soft rustling, like the sound of paper being shuffled, coming from the end of the hall. I turned, my heart racing, my senses on high alert. But when I reached the end of the corridor, there was nothing. The door at the end was slightly ajar, but it led to an empty storage closet. No papers. No strange movements. Just the stillness of a building left behind. But the feeling lingered. Something or someone had been here. I took a step back, and then, as if my body couldn't resist the pull of the place, I turned the handle. The door creaked open. Inside was the forgotten room. The one no one had dared enter in years. It was said to be a storeroom of sorts, a room where past tenants had left old things abandoned after moving out. I had never paid much attention to it before, but something drew me closer now. The room was dark, the light from the hallway casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. There was a musty smell, a mix of mildew and dust. But it wasn't the room that sent a chill down my spine. It was the walls. They were covered with something, scratches, marks, and writing. Random lines and symbols, scrawled hastily in red paint. The same red I had seen in the reports of the disappearances. Red marks that had never been explained. I stood frozen in place. Suddenly, a low sound echoed from behind me. Something, or someone, was moving in the shadows. The sound, soft at first, became clearer with every passing second. It was a dragging noise, like fabric rubbing against the floor, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of there. But my feet stayed frozen to the cold floor. The shadows in the room stretched and warped, bending around the edges like they had a mind of their own. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. The hallway beyond the door remained still, its dim light offering no comfort. No one was there. But the noise, it didn't stop. It continued, coming from behind the stack of old boxes in the corner of the room. My fingers tightened around the door handle as I took a slow, hesitant step forward. My eyes stayed fixed on the shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Another drag, closer now. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This time, I could hear breathing. Soft, steady, but unmistakably there. It was as if someone, or something, was waiting for me just out of sight. I moved towards the boxes. With every step, the noise grew louder, more pronounced. My hands shook as I reached for one of the boxes. It was heavy, old, and covered in a thick layer of dust. As I pulled it away, a foul odor hit me, something rotten, something decayed. I almost gagged, but I couldn't stop now. I had to know. The room beyond the boxes was darker than the rest, its corners swallowed in inky blackness. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I shone it into the space. And that's when I saw it. A figure. A pale, thin shape crouched in the far corner. It didn't move. It just sat there, motionless, its body twisted at an unnatural angle, like it had been broken and reassembled. My throat went dry. For a long moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its face was obscured by strands of hair, wild and unkempt, hanging in front of its eyes. Its hands were unnaturally long, fingers ending in sharp, elongated nails that scraped the floor with every slight movement. I took a step back, but breath caught in my chest. I felt the walls closing in, the air thickening around me. I tried to speak, but no words came. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. Then, the figure moved. It stood up, the joints in its limbs cracking, and with a slow, deliberate motion, it turned its head to face me. I saw its eyes, empty, hollow, dark voids. They stared at me with a depth that seemed to pierce through me, as though it knew everything I'd ever done, every secret I'd ever kept. I stumbled back, my back hitting the wall. The noise, the dragging sound, was louder now, like it was right behind me. I couldn't move. "Who are you?" My voice was barely a whisper, shaking with fear. But it didn't respond. Instead, it took a step toward me, its feet dragging across the floor. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but something deeper, more primal, it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The words hung in the air, cold and jagged. The figure's mouth didn't move when it spoke, but the sound came from somewhere within the shadows, echoing in my mind as much as in the room. I shook my head, fighting against the panic rising in my chest. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. I had to be imagining it. I tried to turn, to run, but my legs were locked in place. My body refused to move, as if some invisible force was holding me there, forcing me to watch. The figure took another step forward, and I felt a chill seep into my bones, the temperature in the room dropping sharply. My breath misted in front of me. Then it spoke again. We were watching. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in on me. The walls, the shadows, the floor, they all felt like they were suffocating me. I could hear the figure's breathing now, louder, more urgent. Its steps became quicker, like it was closing in on me, its presence overwhelming. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room returned to its stillness. The air felt lighter, but the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on my chest. I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been. My heart pounded in my ears. The silence was deafening. I took a few hesitant steps backward, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it real? Was I losing my mind? I couldn't tell anymore. I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, I heard the sound again, the dragging. But this time, it was coming from outside the room, down the hall. I turned quickly, my breath quickening, my hands shaking. I had to get out of there. I yanked open the door, nearly stumbling as I rushed out into the hallway. The noise followed me, echoing down the narrow corridor. My pulse raced as I sprinted toward the stairs, toward the exit. I couldn't look back. I didn't want to know what was chasing me. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, something caught my eye. A figure standing in the doorway of the building, watching me. Its features were obscured by the dim light, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, on my back. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I burst through the door and onto the street, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I took deep, ragged breaths, trying to steady myself. My mind raced with questions, with fear, with disbelief. Was it a ghost? A figment of my imagination? Or was something far darker at play here? As I walked down the street, trying to regain some semblance of control, I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the empty street. But the feeling lingered. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. I couldn't sleep that night. The hours passed in a haze of half-consciousness, my mind replaying every moment from the storage room, the cold air, the dragging noise, the figure in the shadows. My head spun with questions, but the one that stood out above the rest was, what was it? I kept telling myself it was a trick of the light, that my mind had played a cruel joke on me. I'd been under a lot of stress lately, running on little sleep, my thoughts jumbled with the missing persons reports and strange occurrences. Maybe it was just exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I walked down the street, as though the very air around me was thick with something unseen, something lurking just out of reach. I knew I had to go back to the apartment building to find out more. I had to understand what I'd seen, what I'd heard. The nagging thought wouldn't leave me. I grabbed my coat and left my apartment, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As I made my way to the elevator, I heard the faintest sound behind me, like a whisper. But when I turned, there was no one there. I've been hearing things like this more and more lately. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing, and the very city had taken on a sinister edge. I arrived at the building, my mind already racing with possibilities. The landlord was there again, sitting at the front desk, his eyes glued to the paperwork in front of him. He didn't look up as I approached. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded, but his eyes were distant. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something was wrong. Something that he wasn't willing to admit. I asked if I could have a look at the building's records, anything that could explain the strange occurrences. He hesitated, his hand resting on a pile of papers, before reluctantly nodding. "The building's old," he said quietly. "But there's nothing unusual in the records. Just regular maintenance stuff. No complaints, nothing out of the ordinary." I pressed further. "What about the people who've gone missing? Anyone mention anything strange before they disappeared?" The landlord's gaze darkened. He seemed to stiffen, but his lips remained sealed. "People come and go. Some leave quietly, some don't. It's a big city, you know? People disappear all the time." His words were hollow. He knew more than he was letting on, but I wasn't going to push him, at least not yet. There was a certain finality to the way he spoke, a resignation that felt unsettling. I thanked him and left the front desk, making my way up the stairs. The place was eerily quiet, and for the first time, the walls seemed to close in around me, as though they were breathing with me. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from above, but when I looked up, the hallway was empty. I made my way to the storage room, where everything had started. As I approached the door, I noticed something new, a small, dark stain on the floor just inside the threshold. The stain looked fresh, still dark and wet, like something had been dragged across the floor. My stomach turned. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I could hear my breath, loud in the silence. Was I really ready to go back in there? I had no choice. I needed answers. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the familiar musty scent of the room mixing with the cold smell of dampness. The light flickered above, casting a sickly glow over the forgotten room. I looked around, but nothing had changed. The boxes were still piled in the corner, the walls still covered in strange markings. But now, I could see them more clearly, symbols scratched into the paint. I recognized some of them from the missing persons reports, strange glyphs, like the ones in the old stories about the urban haunting. Symbols that were said to be cursed, tied to the spirit that haunted these streets. I took out my phone, snapping a few pictures of the marks on the wall. I could barely make sense of them, but something told me they were important enough to be the key to the mystery. Then, the whispering started again. I froze. It was soft at first, just a murmur in the back of my mind, but it quickly grew louder, becoming a voice, low, raspy, and distant. I couldn't make out the words, but it was clear that the voice was calling to me. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty, but the whispering was still there. I reached for the light switch, flicking it off and on, but the sound persisted, filling the room like a presence. The air thickened, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. I could feel the coldness creeping in again, a pressure building on my chest. I needed to get out. I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room plunged into darkness. The whispering grew louder, closer now. It felt like it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I spun around, my heart racing. A figure. It was standing in the doorway, tall and skeletal, its face obscured by shadows. Its arms were unnaturally long, stretching toward me with fingers that looked too thin, too sharp. It stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I took a step back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure didn't move. But the whispering, it was all around me now, deafening. The words were clearer, but they made no sense. A jumble of syllables, an ancient language that twisted in my mind, pulling at the edges of my sanity. Suddenly, the figure spoke, its voice like 1,000 voices all whispering at once. You are not alone. The room spun, my vision blurred, and the floor beneath me seemed to buckle. I stumbled back, my legs giving way as I fell to the ground. And then, everything went black. I woke up in the hallway outside the room, my body cold, my head pounding. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. I sat up, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. I had to get out of there. I stumbled to my feet and ran, my breath ragged, my mind barely able to process what had just happened. What was that thing? What had it said? You are not alone. I had to go. I had to warn someone. But deep down, I knew whatever had been following me was far from done. It had only just begun. The city had changed. And so had I. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The dark streets of the city felt heavier than usual, more oppressive. The wind had picked up, sending rustling leaves skittering across the pavement, but it felt like something else was moving with them, something unseen. Something waiting. I had run from the building, my heart still pounding in my chest, but no matter how far I went, the sensation didn't leave. The whispers had followed me, echoing in my mind even as I tried to escape. The air felt thicker now, charged with something unnatural. I needed to talk to someone, but who could I trust? I couldn't go to the police, not yet. What could I tell them? That I'd seen a ghost? That something in the shadows had spoken to me in an ancient language? They'd laugh me off, and I'd be labeled insane. No, I had to investigate this on my own, but I needed more information. I knew where to go. My first stop was the old library. It had always been a place I turned to when I needed answers, whether it was for work or just a personal interest. The dusty shelves and the musty smell of books offered comfort. And right now, I needed comfort. I walked through the library's large front doors, the heavy wooden frame creaking as it shut behind me. The familiar smell of paper and dust filled my nostrils, but even here, it didn't feel right. The place felt emptier than usual, quieter than I remembered. The rows of books, neatly arranged, seemed to loom over me like silent sentinels. The fluorescent lights above buzzed in a low hum, adding to the feeling of unease that clung to the air. I made my way to the back of the library, toward the section that housed old records and city archives. My fingers brushed the spines of the books as I passed, each one seeming to whisper its own secrets. I pulled a heavy, leather-bound book from the shelf and opened it. It was filled with local history, and I began to skim the pages, searching for anything that might relate to the strange events I had been experiencing. It didn't take long. There, tucked between records of long-forgotten city politics and the growth of the urban sprawl, I found a mention of a long-dead urban legend, the urban haunting. The same haunting that had been tied to the disappearances, the strange figures in the shadows, and the cursed symbols I'd seen in the storage room. The story was more than just a myth. It had been part of the city's history for decades. According to the records, the urban haunting was tied to a tragedy from the early days of the city's founding. A group of workers, building a new section of the city, had mysteriously vanished. No one knew where they went or if they were even alive. The only thing left behind was strange markings carved into the walls of the tunnels they had been working in, a language no one could understand. The hauntings began soon after. People claimed to see figures standing in alleyways, their faces obscured by shadows. Others heard whispers late at night, growing louder the longer they listened. But the most chilling thing of all was the way those who came into contact with the spirits seemed to disappear one by one, vanishing into the night with no trace. As I read on, I felt a chill settle over me. The legend described a being that was neither alive nor dead, something trapped between worlds, doomed to wander the streets in search of souls to take with it. The being was known as the Prime Nick, a shadow that could take many forms, but whose presence was always felt as an overwhelming, suffocating pressure. The more I read, the more I felt the air around me grow colder. My skin prickled, and I could feel the weight of someone, or something, watching me from the shadows of the library. I quickly closed the book and made my way to the front desk. The librarian, an elderly woman with thin glasses perched on her nose, looked up as I approached. She smiled faintly, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps fear. "I couldn't help but notice you were reading about the Prime Nick," she said quietly. "It's a dangerous topic. Many who seek to know more about it never return." I froze. "Why do you say that?" I asked, my voice tight. Her eyes darted around the library, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Then she leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "Because some things are better left untouched. You don't want to dig too deep into the city's past, especially when it involves the Prime Nick." I was speechless, the words of the librarian hanging in the air like a warning. But the curiosity inside me was stronger than my fear. "I don't care about the stories," I said. "I need to know what happened to those people. The ones who disappeared. The ones the legend speaks of. The librarian's face hardened. She looked at me for a long time, her lips trembling slightly, as though she was deciding whether or not to tell me what she knew. Finally, she spoke. If you're serious about finding the truth, there's one place you can go, the old train yard. My heart skipped a beat. The old train yard? I knew the place. It was abandoned now, a crumbling ruin left over from the city's industrial past. Few people ventured there. The place was dangerous, filled with decaying buildings and overgrown with weeds. It was a place of forgotten history, like the perfect place for something that had been buried for decades. What's there? I asked, barely able to contain my excitement. What's the connection? She shook her head slowly. There are records of the Prime-Nick there. Old files, reports that were buried after the disappearances. Some say it's where the hauntings began. It's the last place where the workers were seen before they vanished. I swallowed hard. I'll go, I said, already knowing I was beyond the point of turning back. Thank you. As I turned to leave, the librarian called after me, her voice a hushed whisper. Be careful. The Prime-Nick isn't just a story. It's real. And it's always watching. I left the library, the weight of her words pressing down on me. The journey to the old train yard would not be easy, but I had to go. Something in me knew the answers were there. And yet, as I walked toward the exit, I couldn't help but feel the whispering again, faint but unmistakable, curling through the air like a thread that was tying me to something much darker than I could have imagined. I wasn't alone. I never had been. The old train yard loomed ahead, a collection of rusted iron and crumbling concrete. It had once been a bustling hub for the city's industrial age, but now it was nothing more than an eerie ghost of its former self. The tracks, long since abandoned, twisted like forgotten veins through the yard, leading to decaying warehouses and open spaces choked with weeds. A cold wind howled through the empty, broken windows of the buildings, carrying with it the faint scent of rust and damp earth. The closer I got, the more I felt the pressure on my chest. It was as if the air itself was thicker here, heavy with something that wasn't quite natural. My footsteps echoed in the silence, the sound too loud, as if mocking the stillness that surrounded me. I had to force myself to keep walking. Every step was a struggle against the growing sense of dread that pressed in from all sides. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every creak of the old yard felt like a warning. I tried to push aside the fear that gripped me. This was what I came for, answers. The truth was buried here, hidden in the ruins of the past. And I was going to find it. The librarian's words echoed in my mind. Be careful. The Prime-Nick isn't just a story. It's real. And it's always watching. I gripped the flashlight in my hand tighter as I stepped into the first of the dilapidated warehouses. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a cloud of dust billowed out, swirling in the beam of my light. The inside was darker than I expected, the light from my flashlight barely cutting through the thick shadows that clung to the walls and rafters. I moved cautiously, scanning the room. The place was filled with old equipment, rusted tools, broken machinery, and piles of debris scattered across the floor. But in the far corner of the room, I saw something strange. A collection of crates, stacked in a way that seemed deliberate, not haphazard like the rest of the yard. Something about them seemed out of place. I approached them slowly, my heart beating louder with each step. My flashlight flickered for a moment, and when it came back on, the crates were just as I remembered, stacked neatly, their wooden slats worn with age but still intact. I bent down and inspected the crates more closely. There were no labels, no markings, just a rough-hewn texture that spoke of time and neglect. As I touched one of the crates, a cold shiver ran down my spine, and I jerked my hand back. The sensation was like ice, as if the crate had absorbed the chill of the grave itself. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. The wind outside whistled through the broken windows, but inside it was silent. Too silent. Then I heard it. A faint scrape, like something dragging across the concrete floor. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing but shadows and dust. Just my imagination. That's all. But the sound came again, louder this time, closer. The air seemed to shift, the atmosphere thickening with an unnatural weight. My breath caught in my chest as I turned slowly, scanning the dark corners of the warehouse. Something was there. And then I saw it. A figure, no more than a shadow, slipped into view at the edge of my flashlight's beam. It was tall, impossibly thin, its form barely more than a silhouette against the dark backdrop of the room. The shape seemed to ripple, shifting in and out of focus, as though it were not fully bound to the space it occupied. For a moment, it looked like a person, and then it didn't. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs were frozen, as if the very air was holding me in place. The figure drifted closer, and I could hear the scraping again, now unmistakably the sound of something dragging across the floor, slow, deliberate, and drawing nearer with each passing second. I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. The figure was so close now, I could almost make out its details, its outline, its shape. It was tall, impossibly so, and the shadows seemed to cling to it like a second skin. I could feel its presence in my bones, an overwhelming sense of cold, of dread. The scraping noise stopped, and for a moment everything was still. The silence pressed on me, suffocating and heavy. Then, in a voice that seemed to echo from deep within the earth, it spoke. Leave. The word was simple, but the weight behind it was immense. It was as though the very air around me was pressing in, suffocating me with the command. Leave, it repeated, more insistent this time, a sharpness to its voice that sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The pressure was too much. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the shadows. The air lightened, and the oppressive weight that had settled on me lifted, though I still felt the lingering presence in the corners of my mind. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Was it real? Or was it just another part of the legend, another fragment of the urban haunting? I didn't know, but I couldn't stay. Not now. Not after that. I turned and fled from the warehouse, the sound of my footsteps pounding in my ears as I ran, as if the darkness itself were chasing me. But the whispers were still there, crawling beneath my skin, filling my mind with 1,000 unanswered questions. What had I just seen? And who, or what, was the Prime Nick? I had to know. I couldn't turn back now. But a part of me, the small, terrified part deep inside, wished I could forget everything and leave this place behind. Because I knew one thing for certain. The Prime Nick wasn't just a story. It was real. And it was waiting for me. It was just past 3 in the morning when the phone rang. A shrill, piercing sound that shattered the silence of the dark room. It jolted me from my half-sleep, leaving my mind foggy and confused. I stared at the glowing screen, eyes struggling to focus. The name on the caller ID was blank. No number, no name, just a void. For a moment, I thought I imagined it. My phone had been silent all night. No messages, no notifications, just the hum of the fridge and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. My apartment had always been quiet, almost too quiet. But now, something felt different. The phone rang again. I felt my heart skip. It was late. Too late for anyone to be calling. Not that I had many people to hear from anyway. But this felt wrong. It had an edge to it, an urgency that clawed at me. I didn't want to answer. I was just about to turn it off when it rang a third time, louder this time, demanding attention. I picked it up. Hello? My voice cracked, still heavy with sleep. There was silence on the other end. A thick, suffocating silence. The kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the kind where you couldn't help but feel like someone was standing right behind you, breathing down your neck. And then, softly, too softly, it came. Run. The voice was cold, monotone, unfamiliar. I couldn't place it. A chill ran down my spine. The words were simple, but they carried a weight I couldn't explain. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a warning. It was a command. Before I could respond, the line went dead. The call ended as abruptly as it had started, leaving me staring at the phone in my hand. I sat there for a long moment, just breathing. The room around me felt wrong, too still, too quiet. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just some prank or a glitch. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted. I looked around the room. My apartment was the same as it had always been. The same worn couch, the same cracked lamp on the side table, the same dull, yellowing wallpaper. But now, it felt like the walls were closing in. Like they were watching me, waiting. I could hear the hum of the fridge again, but it sounded different now. More oppressive. The silence seemed thicker, heavier. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the unease. It was just a phone call. Just a strange, late-night phone call. But then I heard something else. A faint, barely audible sound. A footstep, maybe. It was coming from the hallway, just outside my door. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. Then, a low creak. The sound of something or someone moving against the floorboards. My heart was pounding now. I stood, slow and cautious, my eyes locked on the door, willing it to stay still. I took a step toward it, each footfall feeling louder in the otherwise silent apartment. But as I reached for the handle, I heard it again. A sound scraping like something sliding across the floor. Something unnatural. I froze. The room felt colder. The light from the hallway seemed dimmer, flickering slightly, as if the very atmosphere around me was bending, distorting. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if something was truly out of place. The silence was back, but now it felt pregnant with anticipation. I hesitated. Should I open the door? Should I check? But I already knew. I wasn't alone. I was being watched. I glanced back at my phone, still in my hand. The screen was dark now, but the feeling lingered. The voice on the other end, whoever it was, had said only 2 words. Run. But from what? What was out there? What was hiding in the shadows? I could feel the dread creeping back, pooling in my stomach, and all I wanted to do was ignore it. Ignore the growing panic clawing at my chest. But the thing is, I couldn't. Not anymore. I turned the knob, and I opened the door. The hallway beyond was empty, just as I expected. The faint light from the street lamp outside filtered through the window at the far end, casting long shadows across the floor. Nothing moved. Nothing was there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all wrong. The air was thicker now. The house felt too quiet, too still. Even the hum of the fridge had gone silent. I stepped into the hallway, my bare feet pressing against the cool wooden floor. Each step felt heavier, each sound amplified. The house seemed to be holding its breath. I started walking, but that's when I heard it again. The scraping sound. This time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the living room. I froze. It wasn't the sound of something being dragged. It wasn't even a noise I could easily identify. It was something more insidious. Something unnatural. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. Moving across the wall. It wasn't like any shadow I'd seen before. It wasn't simply cast by a light. This shadow, it moved. It swirled, twisting into something that shouldn't have been there. My heart was pounding now, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I tried to move, to step back, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if the air around me had thickened, become too dense to escape. The shadow stopped. It lingered for a moment, just long enough for me to make out the vague shape of something large, something looming. And then it shifted again, moving closer. I could hear it now. The sound of heavy breathing. It wasn't mine. And that's when I realized whatever was in the room with me, it wasn't human. I turned and ran. I didn't look back as I ran. I couldn't. My legs were moving of their own accord, pushing me down the hallway, each step faster than the last. The sound of my own feet pounding against the floorboards was drowned out by the strange thudding that seemed to follow me, like something, or someone, was right behind me. The shadow, it moved again. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the way the air changed. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It wasn't my imagination. Something was here, and it wasn't letting me go. I reached the end of the hallway, where the door to the living room was slightly ajar. The faint light from the street lamp outside spilled across the floor, casting long, warped shadows inside. But what I saw wasn't the room I knew. The walls were distorted, shifting as if they were breathing. The very fabric of the room seemed to warp and bend, making the space feel too large, too foreign. The furniture, my furniture, was out of place, as though it had been rearranged by something that didn't understand how to make sense of it. I glanced back. Nothing. But the sense of being watched was still there, crawling under my skin like 1,000 insects, unsettling and relentless. My breath came in quick bursts, and I fought the panic that was threatening to overwhelm me. I had to get out. I had to get away from whatever was in here with me. I turned toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The cold metal sent a shock up my arm, but I twisted it anyway, throwing the door wide open. The gust of cold air hit me like a slap to the face. I stepped outside. It was worse than I expected. The apartment building, which had always been so quiet and mundane, now felt like a labyrinth. The stairs that led to the other floors seemed endless, the walls closing in with each step I took. The entire building was unnaturally silent. There was no sound of distant voices, no hum of city traffic through the thin walls. Just an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I moved quickly, almost stumbling as I descended the stairs, trying to get to the street, to get to safety. But as I reached the bottom of the staircase, I felt the air shift again. The sensation of being watched returned, stronger now, and I knew, without a doubt, that whatever it was here with me. I turned sharply, my eyes scanning the empty lobby. It was dimly lit, the only light coming from a cracked bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was no one there, no one in sight. But then I heard it. A soft scraping sound, the same one I had heard before. It was faint at first, like something or someone was moving just out of sight. My pulse quickened. And then I saw it. A shadow moved across the wall in the far corner of the lobby, stretching out like a dark, twisted silhouette. It was impossible to mistake. It wasn't just a shadow, it was alive. The shape shifted again, growing longer, more defined. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I could see the vague outline of something large, something massive, but there was no face. No eyes. Just the shadow, twisting and writhing in ways that defied logic. My body froze. My breath caught in my throat. And then it came. Not like footsteps. It wasn't the sound of something walking, but something dragging itself across the floor. The scraping grew louder, sharper, like claws on tile. My legs finally obeyed, and I bolted forward, heading straight for the door to the outside. I didn't dare look back. The lobby door was just ahead, but before I could reach it, I heard the sound again, closer this time. The scraping was louder now, more frantic, as though whatever it was gaining on me, pushing through the air, closing the distance between us with every second. I was almost there, my hand outstretched toward the door handle, but then the door slammed shut. I froze. The room felt colder again. The air was thick with the smell of something metallic, like blood. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. And there it was. A figure. A tall, inhuman shape, standing at the far end of the hallway. Its outline was barely visible in the dim light, but the sense of dread it emitted was overwhelming. It was still for a moment, just long enough to send a tremor of fear through my entire body before it began to move. Not in a natural way, but in jerky, unsettling motions, as if it were struggling to control its own movements. Each step it took echoed through the empty space, the scraping noise growing louder, as though its body was made of something unnatural, scraping against itself with each movement. I turned to the door, desperately yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was locked in. Trapped. I backed away from the door, my eyes never leaving the figure as it advanced. Its movements were slow, deliberate. It wasn't in a hurry. It didn't need to be. The fear was already in me, its presence already overwhelming. The figure grew larger, its shape becoming more defined, the details sharper. I could see the contours of its body now, the long, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch too far, the fingers that were elongated, tipped with sharp, jagged nails. And then, its face. But it wasn't a face. Not like anything I knew. It was a blur. A shifting mass of shadows that constantly morphed and changed, never settling into something recognizable. There were eyes, though. Eyes that were just holes in the darkness, staring at me, pulling me in. I could feel them pressing against me, suffocating me. I had to get out. I spun around, desperate to find a way to escape. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing in like they were alive. There was no exit, no escape. And then I heard it again. The voice. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was loud, commanding, "Run." I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my mind reeling. The figure was almost on top of me now, its fingers outstretched, ready to reach for me. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, just that I had to get away. But no matter how fast I moved, it was always right behind me, scraping, dragging, never far enough. And I knew, without a doubt, that I was running from something that wasn't just in the building. It was in my head, too. I didn't stop running. My breath came in ragged gasps as I dashed through the narrow hallways of the building. The air seemed to close in around me, growing thicker with each step. I didn't dare to glance behind me. Every instinct screamed at me to move faster, but the faster I ran, the more I felt it, an overwhelming sense that I was not just being chased, but hunted. The scraping sound, sharp and deliberate, echoed through the corridor, growing louder with every footstep I took. It was no longer a distant noise. It was right there, just behind me, following me like a predator with no need for speed. Its presence was suffocating, as if the very air I breathed was infected with it. I rounded a corner, my legs burning from the effort, but there was no relief. The building stretched endlessly in front of me, the hallways winding like a maze that had no exit. I had been here 1,000 times before, but now every inch of it felt foreign, hostile. The familiar walls seemed to distort as if mocking my attempt to escape. I slammed into a door, the cold metal handle biting into my palm as I wrenched it open. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb overhead. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea where I was. This wasn't any of the rooms I recognized. It wasn't even the basement. The sound followed me. It was here, just beyond the doorframe, creeping into the room like a shadow. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The footsteps that had once been distant were now so close, I could almost feel the weight of them pressing down on my chest. I backed into the corner of the room, my hand gripping the cold concrete wall as I tried to steady myself. I didn't know where to go. There was nowhere to hide. The floor beneath me seemed to tremble with each step the creature, or whatever it was, took. And then, the voice. Run. It wasn't a command anymore. It wasn't a whisper. It was an echo, resonating in my mind, bouncing off the walls of my skull. It felt like it was inside my head, clawing its way through my thoughts, twisting them. It was everywhere. I closed my eyes, trying to shut it out, but the voice kept coming, relentless. Run. 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 Each repetition was more frantic, more desperate, until I felt as though I might lose my grip on reality. The scraping sound stopped. I dared to glance up, my eyes scanning the dark room for any sign of movement. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me like a physical force. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Then, I saw it. It was not far from me, standing in the far corner of the room, but it was no longer just a shadow. It had form now, but its shape was still a blur, constantly shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. Its limbs stretched out too far, too thin, like they belonged to something not quite human. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The sight of it filled me with a terror so raw, so primal, that it was hard to think, hard to even comprehend what I was seeing. It was there, standing still, but its presence was overwhelming, like the very air was charged with static, every inch of space buzzing with an unnatural energy. The thing didn't speak. It didn't need to. I could feel its intent. It was coming for me. And this time, there was no escape. My legs felt like lead, but I had to move. I had to get out. I forced my body to respond, pushing myself away from the wall. But before I could take a step, I heard it again, the scraping sound. This time, it wasn't coming from the creature. It was coming from all around me. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was everywhere. The room seemed to close in on me. The shadows on the walls stretched out, growing longer, twisting, turning into shapes I couldn't identify. The sound of scratching, like claws on stone, filled my ears, drowning out all rational thought. The walls groaned under the pressure, the floor beneath my feet buckling, as if the very building was being consumed by whatever was lurking in the dark. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing, my eyes wide with panic. I wasn't sure if the room was changing or if it was my mind, shattered, distorted by fear. The creature in the corner shifted again, its silhouette now clearer, though still incomprehensible, as if it had no true form. It was just a collection of darkness and movement, something that could not, should not, exist. It reached out. Not with hands, but with tendrils of shadow that stretched unnaturally toward me. They twisted and curled like living things, and I could feel their coldness even from where I stood. They were faster than I could react, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me toward the thing. I screamed, but it was swallowed by the void. The air was so cold, colder than it had ever been before. My skin prickled with frost as the darkness pressed against me, suffocating me. The walls were no longer walls, but shifting surfaces of blackness, closing in, pulling me further into the unknown. I fought, kicking and thrashing, but the tendrils wrapped tighter around me, dragging me toward the center of the room. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped. Run, the voice came again, echoing in my mind. But it wasn't the voice from the phone. It was mine. My own voice. It was too much. I couldn't make sense of it anymore. The fear was too overwhelming, too all-encompassing. I was drowning in it. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the room went silent. I was released. The tendrils disappeared into the air, evaporating like mist. The room was still once again, the air heavy with an oppressive quiet. I could barely stand. My legs were shaking, my entire body trembling from the shock of what I had just experienced. But then I heard it again. The scraping. Not in the room. Not in the walls. It was outside. The sound of something, or someone, moving in the hallway. I didn't look. I couldn't look. I just turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not until I reached the street. But I knew it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. I didn't look back as I burst through the doors, stepping onto the cold concrete of the street. The night air hit me like a slap, but I barely felt it. My body was numb, every muscle still locked in that primal fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, even though I knew the building was empty. There was no one. There couldn't be. But then why did it still feel like I was being followed? The city was eerily quiet, and the usual hum of distant traffic was absent. The world felt too still, too vacant. I could hear nothing but my own breathing, ragged and shallow, as I stumbled forward, my feet barely finding purchase on the cracked sidewalk. It was as if the whole world had held its breath while I fled the building. I turned the corner, pushing forward through the labyrinth of alleyways, knowing, deep down, that I was still running from something far worse than any human could ever be. It wasn't just a figure. It wasn't just a thing that could be explained. It was something that existed between worlds, something that shouldn't be able to move in the way it did. The scraping sound, soft at first, had returned. It echoed down the empty street behind me. I could hear it in my mind now, not just in the air. It clawed at the edges of my sanity, pulling at my thoughts like an invisible hand. I stumbled and nearly fell, my knees buckling under the pressure, but I managed to catch myself against a lamppost. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't give in to the fear. Not after everything. I pushed myself forward, the streets growing more unfamiliar with every step. The city around me seemed to bend in on itself, the buildings warping and flickering like something in a bad dream. I looked up, searching for something, anything that felt real. But the streetlights overhead blinked erratically, casting shadows that stretched and twisted unnaturally along the pavement. Every step felt like I was sinking deeper, not just into the city, but into something darker. The road ahead was littered with debris, broken glass, overturned trash cans, abandoned cars that seemed to have been left in a hurry. As I moved further, the walls of the buildings began to feel as though they were closing in around me. The narrow alleyways started to shift, changing direction while I wasn't looking, making it impossible to tell where I was going. I couldn't even remember how long I had been walking. Hours? Minutes? Time seemed irrelevant now. The air was thick with an unnatural humidity, and I could taste the metal tang of blood in my mouth. I hadn't realized I had been biting my lip until I tasted it. My heart raced as I pressed on, the sound of scraping growing louder, closer, like it was right behind me, crawling across the pavement. I felt the pressure building in my chest, a tightness that made it hard to breathe. Then, in the distance, I saw something. A figure. A shape. I froze. It was standing at the far end of the alley, bathed in the harsh glow of a flickering street lamp. I couldn't make out any details at first. It was too far away, just a shadow, an outline against the light. But as I blinked, the figure shifted. The scraping noise stopped. Everything went silent. I felt the ground beneath me shift, like the entire world had taken a step closer. The figure moved, and with each motion, the scraping started again. It was slow, methodical, almost as if it was savoring the sound. I could feel my pulse racing in my throat, the blood pumping so loud in my ears I could barely hear anything else. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't a man or a woman. It was something else. The shape moved in jerky, unnatural motions like it didn't belong in this world. Its limbs stretched too far, too long, and the shadows around it seemed to bend in ways they shouldn't. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Something about the way it moved paralyzed me, like I couldn't look away even if I wanted to. But then, it did something unexpected. It tilted its head. The movement was fluid, almost human, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something familiar, something that made me sick to my stomach. The face. But it wasn't a face at all. There were eyes, yes, but they weren't human eyes. They were hollow, empty voids in the darkness, endless and deep, like black holes that seemed to suck in the very light around them. The mouth, there was no mouth, no features that I could recognize. It was just darkness, swallowing, consuming, pressing in on itself. I could barely stand. My legs were shaking, my entire body trembling from the shock of what I had just experienced. But then I heard it again. The scraping. Not in the room. Not in the walls. It was outside. The sound of something or someone moving in the hallway. I didn't look. I couldn't look. I just turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not until I reached the street. But I knew it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. I didn't look back as I burst through the doors, stepping onto the cold concrete of the street. The night air hit me like a slap, but I barely felt it. My body was numb, every muscle still locked in that primal fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, even though I knew the building was empty. There was no one. There couldn't be. But then why did it still feel like I was being followed? The city was eerily quiet, and the usual hum of distant traffic was absent. The world felt too still, too vacant. I could hear nothing but my own breathing, ragged and shallow, as I stumbled forward, my feet barely finding purchase on the cracked sidewalk. It was as if the whole world had held its breath while I fled the building. I turned the corner, pushing forward through the labyrinth of alleyways, knowing, deep down, that I was still running from something far worse than any human could ever be. It wasn't just a figure. It wasn't just a thing that could be explained. It was something that existed between worlds, something that shouldn't be able to move in the way it did. The scraping sound, soft at first, had returned. It echoed down the empty street behind me. I could hear it in my mind now, not just in the air. It clawed at the edges of my sanity, pulling at my thoughts like an invisible hand. I stumbled and nearly fell, my knees buckling under the pressure, but I managed to catch myself against a lamppost. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't give in to the fear. Not after everything. I pushed myself forward, the streets growing more unfamiliar with every step. The city around me seemed to bend in on itself, the buildings warping and flickering like something in a bad dream. I looked up, searching for something, anything that felt real. But the streetlights overhead blinked erratically, casting shadows that stretched and twisted unnaturally along the pavement. Every step felt like I was sinking deeper, not just into the city, but into something darker. The road ahead was littered with debris, broken glass, overturned trash cans, abandoned cars that seemed to have been left in a hurry. As I moved further, the walls of the buildings began to feel as though they were closing in around me. The narrow alleyways started to shift, changing direction while I wasn't looking, making it impossible to tell where I was going. I couldn't even remember how long I had been walking. Hours? Minutes? Time seemed irrelevant now. The air was thick with an unnatural humidity, and I could taste the metal tang of blood in my mouth. I hadn't realized I had been biting my lip until I tasted it. My heart raced as I pressed on, the sound of scraping growing louder, closer, like it was right behind me, crawling across the pavement. I felt the pressure building in my chest, a tightness that made it hard to breathe. Then, in the distance, I saw something. A figure. A shape. I froze. It was standing at the far end of the alley, bathed in the harsh glow of a flickering street lamp. I couldn't make out any details at first. It was too far away, just a shadow, an outline against the light. But as I blinked, the figure shifted. The scraping noise stopped. Everything went silent. I felt the ground beneath me shift, like the entire world had taken a step closer. The figure moved, and with each motion, the scraping started again. It was slow, methodical, almost as if it was savoring the sound. I could feel my pulse racing in my throat, the blood pumping so loud in my ears I could barely hear anything else. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't a man or a woman. It was something else. The shape moved in jerky, unnatural motions like it didn't belong in this world. Its limbs stretched too far, too long, and the shadows around it seemed to bend in ways they shouldn't. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Something about the way it moved paralyzed me, like I couldn't look away even if I wanted to. But then, it did something unexpected. It tilted its head. The movement was fluid, almost human, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something familiar, something that made me sick to my stomach. The face. But it wasn't a face at all. There were eyes, yes, but they weren't human eyes. They were hollow, empty voids in the darkness, endless and deep, like black holes that seemed to suck in the very light around them. The mouth. There was no mouth, no features that I could recognize. It was just darkness, swallowing, consuming, pressing in on itself. Then, in that moment, it spoke. Not in words, but in a feeling. A cold, sharp sensation that pierced my chest and made my lungs burn. It knows you. My heart stopped. I could feel the echo of its voice inside my skull, reverberating against the walls of my mind. I closed my eyes, desperately trying to block it out, but it didn't work. The words weren't just spoken, they were felt. They were imprinted on my very being, seeping into every pore like a virus that had no cure. It knows you. The world seemed to bend and shift around me. The alleyway stretched endlessly, the buildings twisting and warping, becoming something alien. The distant streetlights flickered and buzzed, and the shadows, those long, twisting shapes, seemed to move closer, wrapping around me like a noose. I couldn't run. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my body heavy with the weight of the fear that had taken root inside me. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the figure stopped moving. It tilted its head again, its empty eyes boring into me, and for a second, I thought I saw something that wasn't the creature. It was a face, but not the one I expected. It was mine. The reflection twisted, jagged, and cracked, but there I was, staring back at myself from the blackness. My own face, my own eyes, empty, hollow, lifeless. It wasn't a reflection. It was me, but it wasn't. I snapped my head away, gasping for air, my heart thundering in my chest. I couldn't process it. I couldn't understand it. But there was one thing I knew for certain now. The thing in the alley wasn't just chasing me. It was me. I stumbled backward, my body trembling, every muscle in my legs locked with terror. The world around me, the alley, the flickering lights, the creature itself, seemed to warp further into some kind of maddening dreamscape. The streets stretched endlessly, the buildings leaning in like they were watching me, waiting for something. Waiting for me to break. I couldn't breathe. The air had become thick, suffocating, each breath more labored than the last. But my body refused to stop. I kept moving, my feet dragging me forward in a desperate, futile attempt to escape the presence that was now so deeply embedded in my mind. I wasn't just running anymore, I was fleeing from myself. The scraping sound followed me, quiet but persistent, like the scrape of claws against stone. It echoed in my skull, reminding me that I wasn't alone. I dared to glance over my shoulder, and there it was again. The figure. But this time, it wasn't far off. It was closer, right behind me, just out of sight, its shadow stretching impossibly long on the pavement. The air hummed with the sensation of its approach, vibrating against my skin, crawling under my nails. It knows you. The words rang in my head again. The voice. My own voice, but twisted. Distorted. The sense of being followed by something I couldn't see, but somehow could feel, grew more intense with every passing second. It wasn't just chasing me. It wasn't just following me. It was me. The reflection wasn't some trick of the mind. It was a part of me, something that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to break free. I ran faster, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. Every corner I turned, the streets seemed to stretch further into some endless void. The alleyways blurred together. The familiar landmarks of the city twisted, became unrecognizable. It felt like I was trapped in a loop, a maze designed to keep me here, alone, lost, with nowhere to hide. I tried to scream, but the sound got caught in my throat. My voice was swallowed by the silence, the oppressive silence that wrapped around me like a blanket, choking out every other sound. Even the scraping had stopped. I felt it, though. I felt its eyes on me, watching, waiting. And then, the streetlights flickered one last time, casting the world into darkness. The hum of the city, the distant roar of traffic, the sounds of life, was gone, replaced by a hollow, suffocating quiet. The only thing I could hear now was the sound of my own breathing. My gasps echoed in the darkness like they belonged to someone else. I stopped. My feet dug into the pavement, unwilling to move. Something inside me was telling me to keep running, to get away from whatever was following me, but another part of me, something deeper, told me I had to face it. I couldn't run anymore. Not from this. Not from what was chasing me. Because whatever it was a part of me. I turned slowly, the darkness pressing on me from all sides. The shadows around me seemed to twist, to creep in like living things, stretching and reaching for me. The air was thick, heavy, and the world felt like it was closing in. And there, just a few feet away, it was. The figure stood in the middle of the street, its limbs too long, too thin. It tilted its head, its empty eyes reflecting the pale light of the street lamp. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath me, as though the laws of gravity no longer applied. The figure, no, it stood there, frozen in time. The reflection, the face, it wasn't just my face anymore. It was all of me. Every flaw, every fear, every moment of doubt. The parts of me I had buried deep inside, the parts one had never allowed anyone to see, stood before me in the form of this thing. It was me, but not. It was the version of me that had been hiding in the dark, waiting for the right moment to come out. The version I had pushed aside. The version I was afraid of. And now, it was here. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen in place, a prisoner of my own fear. The thing didn't need to move. It was already there, inside my mind, inside my very soul. Its voice, that twisted, distorted echo of mine, filled the silence again. But this time, it was clearer. Stronger. You've always known. Haven't you? The words were a dagger, cutting through the veil of denial I had wrapped around myself for so long. It wasn't just something that had come out of nowhere. This thing, this reflection, had always been there. Inside me. In my darkest moments, in my most fragile states, it had been growing, waiting. And now, it had taken form. I had never really escaped it. I had never really escaped me. Run. The voice was calm now, almost soothing. It wasn't angry. It wasn't demanding. It was resigned. And somehow, that was worse. The lack of urgency, the acceptance that what was happening now was inevitable. It was happening because it had to. It was happening because I had allowed it. My eyes blurred as tears welled up, but I couldn't look away from the thing in front of me. I couldn't tear myself from its gaze, because I knew that if I did, it would just keep following me. It would be inside me again. And this time, I wouldn't be able to stop it. Run. It was my voice again, but it wasn't me. It wasn't my decision. It was my reflection. The thing that had been inside me all along. The thing that had been waiting for me to realize the truth. It wasn't just a creature. It wasn't just a shadow. It was me. And now it was free. The darkness closed in around me, and I took the first step forward. It was almost midnight when I boarded the last bus of the night, the kind of bus that people took when they had no other choice, the kind that passed through the quieter parts of the city. As I stepped on, the cold night air still clinging to my coat, I couldn't help but feel a strange unease. Something about the emptiness of the street and the way the bus hummed as if alive made my skin crawl. The driver gave me a nod, not bothering to say much. His face was obscured by the shadows in the poorly lit cabin. It wasn't crowded. Just a handful of passengers scattered across the seats, people with tired eyes and heavy thoughts, all of them trying to get somewhere, anywhere, before the world closed in for the night. I took my seat by the window, glancing out at the passing streetlights. The glow was faint, barely lighting the roads that stretched out into the distance. It was the kind of night where the city felt like a maze, and no one was supposed to be here. The engine rumbled softly, pulling away from the station. As the bus began to move, I felt a sudden weight in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was the late hour, or maybe it was just the odd mix of silence and anticipation that hung in the air. But I wasn't alone in my discomfort. The passengers were all still, eyes half-lidded, lost in their own worlds. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something. I couldn't explain it, but something about the atmosphere felt off. Maybe it was the quiet murmur of the engine, the dull thump of the wheels against the pavement, or the occasional, distant sound of a door closing behind us. Each sound felt amplified in the stillness, reverberating through the bus in an almost unnatural way. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that crept up my spine. That's when I noticed the other passengers. They weren't just sitting quietly. No, each one seemed different. As if they were all waiting for something, waiting for the bus to take them to places they didn't want to be. One passenger, a woman with pale skin and dark circles under her eyes, was staring out of the window. She didn't blink. Her eyes were wide open, fixed on the passing streetlights, unblinking, unmoving. Her hands rested stiffly on her lap, as if frozen in time. Another man across from her, hunched over with his face buried in his hands, muttered under his breath in a way that was too soft for me to hear. But what struck me most was the unsettling silence. No one was talking. Not a single sound except for the hum of the bus, the tapping of the tires on the road, and the occasional creak of the seats as people shifted uncomfortably. I tried to focus on something, anything, but the silence was suffocating. Even the dim glow of the streetlights outside seemed to flicker, as though they were uncertain of their purpose. And then, as if on cue, the first voice broke the silence. "Have you ever wondered if this is all just a dream?" the man across from me asked, his voice rough and thin, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. His face was gaunt, his eyes bloodshot. I turned to him, but his gaze was already fixed on me, unblinking. I swallowed hard. His question sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a question anyone would ask in a normal conversation. It felt like a warning, like the beginning of something I couldn't see yet, but I could feel. Before I could respond, he continued. "I've been riding this bus for years, you know? Every night, same route, same people, same empty streets. But sometimes, I think I've seen things that don't belong." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I've seen things that shouldn't be on this bus." I blinked, unsure of how to react. The others on the bus remained as still as statues. It was like no one heard him, or perhaps they just didn't care. The man's gaze was piercing, unsettling. I wanted to look away, but something kept me frozen, his words looping in my mind. What could he mean by that? My pulse quickened, but before I could gather my thoughts, another voice interrupted the growing tension. The woman by the window, the one with the wide, unblinking eyes, suddenly spoke up. "It's not just the bus. It's everything," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the engine. "The streets, they've been getting darker. Haven't you noticed?" Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the armrest. Her voice cracked slightly as she continued, "It's like something's watching us. Something that isn't supposed to be here." She glanced over at the man who had spoken earlier, then back at me. Her eyes were wide, desperate. "Every night, I feel it. I can hear it, too." I looked around at the other passengers, searching for any sign of reaction. But no one moved, no one spoke. It was as though they were waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to share their stories. I wasn't sure if I should respond, or if I even could. The atmosphere was thick, the air charged with something I couldn't quite understand. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the weight of their words pressing down on me. Was this just paranoia? Or was something truly wrong? I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, glancing nervously out the window. But it was too dark outside. The streets blurred into shadows, the glow of the streetlights fading into the black void beyond. There was something about the city at night that was different. Something off. The silence that followed the woman's words was heavier than before. Her eyes never left mine, and I felt a chill spread across my body as if her gaze had pierced through me. I turned away, hoping to break the tension, but the feeling lingered like a thick fog. The bus continued to roll through the night, the occasional flicker of the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows against the windows. I shifted uneasily in my seat, trying to focus on something, anything, to shake off the discomfort. But the man who had spoken earlier wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his face now illuminated by the faint light from above. His eyes locked onto me once again, his expression now more intense. "I wasn't always like this, you know," he murmured, his voice trembling with an unsettling urgency. "I didn't always see things. It was just a regular bus ride, until that night. I felt a lump form in my throat, my curiosity pushing me to listen despite the growing unease that coiled around my chest." He sighed, looking down at his hands before speaking again. "It was about a year ago. Same bus, same time. I'd been riding it for months, not thinking twice about it. But that night, something was different. Something felt different. I didn't know what it was at first. But then I saw it. Something else was on the bus with us. I glanced around at the others. No one reacted. No one interrupted. It was like they were all waiting for the same thing to unfold. The woman by the window, still staring blankly ahead, tightened her grip on the armrest, her knuckles pale. "What do you mean?" I finally managed to ask, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "What did you see?" The man's lips curled into a grimace. He didn't answer immediately, as though he was trying to choose his words carefully. The bus rattled over the uneven streets, and for a moment, the sounds outside the vehicle felt distorted, stretched out, as though they were coming from a distant place. "I saw it," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "It was standing near the door, just watching us." I didn't notice at first. It wasn't until the others started shifting, looking nervous, like they could feel it too. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at it, and it smiled. His eyes flickered toward the back of the bus, as if he could still see the thing he was describing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just empty seats, dimly lit by the yellowish lights above. "It wasn't a person," he continued, his voice trembling. "At least not like you or me. Its face, its eyes, they were wrong. I can't even describe it properly. Just wrong. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It was like the air itself was holding me in place. And the worst part? It didn't get off the bus. We just drove by. And when I looked back, I swore I saw it smiling. I could hear the faint catch in his breath as he finished his story, and for the first time, I realized how thin the line between reality and fear really was. There was a long pause. I had no idea how to respond. Was this just a strange hallucination? Or was he telling the truth? The tension in the bus was thickening, and I could feel the eyes of the other passengers on me. The woman beside the window slowly turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable. "You think you've seen something," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "You think that was bad? You don't know what it's really like until you hear my story." Her voice was calm, but there was a faint tremor underneath, one that made me shiver despite the warm air inside the bus. The man who had spoken first raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The other passengers remained still, their eyes locked on her. "I don't know if I should tell you," she continued, her gaze shifting from the man back to me. "But I have to. You need to understand what you're dealing with." She paused, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat, knuckles white. "I've been on this bus for years. Same route. Same time. And there's something you need to know. About the driver." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice even more. "You see, it's always him. Always the same driver. He never speaks. He just drives. But one night, I asked him where he was going. Just out of curiosity. And you know what he said?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He said we were going nowhere." Her words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I felt a coldness creep up my spine. What was she talking about? How could he be going nowhere? Her face was pale now, her eyes wide, the pupils dilated as if she were reliving the moment. I didn't think much of it at first. But then I realized. Every night, the bus stopped at the same place. The same intersection. The same street corner. but it was never the same corner. It changed. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. And the worst part? I've seen people get off the bus at that corner. But when I looked back, they were never there. Like they were never really there to begin with. My heart was pounding now, the unease growing into full-blown dread. The air in the bus felt thicker now, stifling, almost suffocating. "You think it's just a bus ride," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it's not. It's a journey into something else. Something waiting for us." I looked around at the others. The man with the gaunt face had slumped back into his seat, eyes closed, as if trying to block out the truth. The woman was still looking at me, her face drained of color. No one spoke. No one moved. I couldn't breathe. My head was spinning. And the worst part? The bus kept moving. We kept riding through the night, deeper into a darkness I couldn't comprehend. Each passing streetlight felt more like a shadow than a beacon. The driver didn't look back. The doors didn't open. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we were moving towards something much worse than anything I could imagine. Something otherworldly. The words hung in the air like thick smoke, suffocating everything around us. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, each thud more desperate than the last. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I had just heard. The woman's story made no sense. It couldn't. But something about it, her voice, her eyes, felt undeniably real. I glanced around, hoping for some semblance of comfort, but there was only silence. The other passengers had returned to their seats, staring blankly into space, avoiding eye contact. The atmosphere on the bus had shifted. It felt heavier now, as if the very air had thickened with dread. The bus rumbled on through the night, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and the faint creak of the wheels on the pavement. Streetlights flickered past, casting brief, distorted shadows across the worn leather seats. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to break the tension. But my throat was dry, and the words caught in my mouth. Instead, I turned back to the woman, my mind still reeling from what she had said. "You," I started, but my voice faltered. "You said the driver, the same corner. What do you mean? What's going on with the bus? Why is it different?" She turned slowly toward me, her eyes hollow, her face ashen in the dim light. She didn't speak for a moment, just stared at me like I was the only one who could hear her. Then, with a quiet, almost inaudible voice, she spoke again. "You don't understand," she said, her tone brittle. "The bus doesn't go anywhere. It takes us somewhere else. Somewhere no one can see." I tried to process her words. Somewhere else? My mind screamed at me to dismiss it, to call it all some shared delusion or a twisted game. But the way she said it, the urgency, the fear, it was too real to ignore. "Somewhere else?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "Where? What are you talking about?" She shivered, her body trembling as if from cold, despite the warm air in the bus. Her hands gripped the armrests so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I've been on this bus too many times to ignore the signs. I've seen it before, over and over again." I leaned in closer, my pulse quickening. "What signs?" For a brief moment, she hesitated, her eyes darting to the door at the front of the bus. She seemed to be listening for something, as if afraid of being heard. Then, lowering her voice even further, she spoke. "The signs are in the faces of the passengers. Have you noticed how some of them don't blink? How some of them don't breathe? I glanced around quickly, but no one seemed to be paying attention to us. The other passengers sat still, their heads tilted in strange angles, their eyes unblinking. I couldn't tell if it was the dim lighting playing tricks on me, or if what she was saying was actually happening. My eyes lingered on the man who had spoken first. He was still sitting there, staring into space, his eyes wide and unfocused. I couldn't see any visible signs of movement. Was he breathing? I couldn't tell. A chill ran down my spine. It's not just the passengers, she continued, her voice trembling now, breaking with the weight of what she was about to say. It's the driver. He's not human. He's something else. I've seen it in his eyes before, the way they don't reflect. You ever notice that? How when you look into his eyes, you don't see yourself. Like he's not really there. He's a part of whatever this is. A part of the darkness. Her words were like a punch to the gut. I tried to focus on the driver, sitting up front, his face obscured by the rearview mirror. But I couldn't make out any details. Just shadows. The bus lights flickered again, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw something moving in the reflection of the mirror. But it was gone in an instant. I thought I was just paranoid, she went on, her voice barely audible. I thought it was just me, you know? But after everything I've seen, I know now that this bus, it's not just a ride. It's not just a bus. She paused, her eyes glassy with fear. It's a trap. The weight of her words pressed down on me. Trap? What kind of trap? Before I could ask, the bus jolted suddenly, throwing me against my seat. I gasped, my heart racing. The lights above flickered, casting the bus into a strobe-like effect, and for a split second, I thought I saw the figure of the driver in the reflection of the door, a shadowy, tall form with impossibly long arms reaching toward the back of the bus. I blinked, and it was gone. The woman next to me saw my reaction and nodded, her face pale with understanding. You saw it, didn't you? She whispered. You felt it. It's not just the bus. It's everything around us. The place we're in. We're not in the real world anymore. My hands began to shake as I looked around, the weight of her words suffocating me. Everything felt wrong. The air felt thick, as though it was pressing against me. I could barely breathe. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the soft hum of the bus. Where are we going? I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. The woman shook her head slowly, her eyes wide with terror. I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. But we're not getting off this bus until it's over. I turned to look out the window, but all I saw was darkness. The streets had disappeared. We were driving through nothingness, no buildings, no trees, no signs of life. Only endless blackness. And then, from the very back of the bus, came a sound. It started as a faint, almost imperceptible scraping noise. Something dragging along the floor. It was quiet at first, but then it grew louder, until it filled the bus, echoing in my ears. The sound was coming closer. The scraping sound was now unmistakable, sharp, screeching, like something metal being dragged across the floor. I could feel it vibrating through the soles of my shoes, and it made my teeth ache. My pulse quickened, my hands sweaty. My eyes shot around the bus, but no one else seemed to react. The other passengers remained frozen in their seats, their eyes vacant, their bodies unnaturally still. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, but the sound was growing louder. Closer. It was as if whatever was causing it was moving through the aisles, sliding towards the front, where I was sitting. I turned to the woman next to me. She had her eyes squeezed shut, her hands clutching the armrests, her knuckles white. Her body was trembling, the only movement in the otherwise still bus. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. She nodded, her face pale, her lips trembling. "It's coming. It's coming closer." I tried to swallow the panic rising in my throat, but it felt like a stone lodged there, choking me. My eyes darted to the back of the bus, where the sound was now unmistakably distinct, almost like a wet, dragging shuffle. I could feel it. Someone was moving toward us. But I couldn't see anything. There were no shadows, no figures in the aisle, nothing to explain the noise that was now rattling my bones. I reached for my phone, the only lifeline to reality I had left, but when I tried to unlock it, the screen remained black. I pressed harder, desperate, but nothing happened. It was dead. The woman's voice broke the silence again, though this time it was more urgent, more frantic. "We're not alone here," she hissed. We never were. I looked at her, my eyes wide, heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling. "The bus, it's not just a mode of transportation. It's a vessel. A place. It feeds on us, feeds on our fear. It takes us to places we don't belong." I shook my head, trying to grasp her words. "This doesn't make sense. What are you talking about? Where are we going? What is this place?" But she didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the back of the bus, her eyes wide with terror. The dragging sound was now a heavy, rhythmic thumping, as if something or someone was approaching on all fours. The sound was so intense that it felt like the walls of the bus were closing in on me. I could almost feel the temperature drop, the air turning colder and heavier. I was suffocating. Panic bubbled up from deep within me, and I instinctively clutched at the seat in front of me to steady myself. My breath was ragged, each exhale leaving a visible cloud in the icy air. The woman next to me was trembling violently now. She was looking straight ahead, her pupils dilated, her mouth working silently, as if trying to form words but failing. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but as I did, I felt it. A cold, clammy hand wrapped around my wrist. I jerked my arm back with a gasp, my heart leaping into my throat. The hand had been so real, so solid. But when I looked around, no one was there. The scraping noise had stopped. For a fleeting moment, everything was still again, but that stillness was worse than the sound. The tension in the air was thick and suffocating. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, feel my body freezing in place, unable to move. Are we dead?" I whispered, the question slipping from my lips before I could stop it. The woman beside me didn't respond. She only stared ahead, her face ashen, her eyes wild. Thump. The sound broke the silence, but this time it wasn't coming from the back of the bus. It was coming from right behind me. I turned quickly, my neck snapping in the direction of the noise, my body frozen with fear. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Just the empty seats, the familiar old windows, the dim lights above. But something was wrong. Something was missing. The world outside the bus was gone. There were no streets, no buildings, no lights. The windows were filled with nothingness. Just a vast, infinite blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. The lights outside, the streetlights, had vanished. The world I had once known was no longer there. I felt my stomach twist, my heart sinking. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. I reached out for the door handle, but before I could touch it, a chill swept through the bus, colder than before, making my teeth chatter. The air was thick now, almost too dense to breathe. Thump, thump, thump. The noise was now unbearable. It wasn't a shuffle or drag anymore. It was like something was stomping toward us, slow, heavy steps that echoed through the hollow bus. And then, just as suddenly as the noise had started, everything stopped. The bus had come to a complete stop. My body stiffened. We weren't moving anymore. But where were we? Where had we stopped? I turned to the woman beside me, my throat dry, my hands shaking. Where are we? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were locked on the front of the bus, her breath shallow and erratic. It's here, she muttered. It's here. We're not going anywhere anymore. Before I could react, the lights above flickered again, and the driver's voice echoed through the bus. Final stop, he said, his tone flat, mechanical. Please exit immediately. I looked up, my mind screaming, but the words died in my throat. The driver wasn't in his seat. And the door was open. The darkness outside was inviting, pulling us in. It was time to step off. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if what I was seeing was real. The door was wide open now, the infinite darkness outside drawing me in like a magnet. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, my legs frozen. The woman beside me was still staring ahead, her hands clutched tightly to her knees. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes were wide with terror, but there was something else there, something deeper, as though she had long accepted the inevitable. I tried to speak again, but my voice faltered, choking on the air, thick with the weight of the unknown. What do we do? Where are we? Where is everyone? But she didn't respond. The only thing that moved now was the eerie, pulsating light above us. It flickered erratically, casting long, unnatural shadows that twisted across the bus floor. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. Every breath felt too loud, every heartbeat too heavy. I glanced at the other passengers. They hadn't moved either. They were like mannequins, frozen in time. Their eyes empty, lifeless. I wanted to scream, to shake them awake, but something deep in my gut told me that if I did, they wouldn't respond. They couldn't. Then, there was the thump again, loud and unmistakable. It was closer now. Much closer. I could feel it beneath my feet, reverberating through the floor like a distant, thunderous drumbeat. My stomach lurched. Whatever it was that was out there, in the dark, was getting closer. I tried to look outside again. The nothingness beyond the door seemed to stretch on forever. There were no stars. No moon. Just a suffocating, endless black. The air felt heavier, colder, and my pulse quickened. My skin tingled with the sensation of being watched, but there was no one to watch. No one visible. Only the crushing emptiness. The sound of dragging metal, the scraping noise that had haunted me for what felt like hours, was now a deafening roar. It sounded like something or someone was moving toward us. Slowly, deliberately. I could feel the temperature drop. A coldness that sank deep into my bones, chilling me to the core. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to step off the bus, not into that dark abyss. But I felt a strange compulsion, like invisible hands were guiding me. Do we have a choice? I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. No one responded. The woman beside me was still lost in her own thoughts, eyes glazed over. She was already gone, lost to whatever force had claimed this bus, this place, and she wasn't coming back. The driver's voice echoed once more, but this time it didn't sound human. It was mechanical, warped, distorted, like it was coming from a speaker underwater. Final stop, the voice intoned, its tone emotionless. Please exit immediately. The door creaked again, the hinges groaning in protest. The darkness outside seemed to beckon like an open mouth, waiting to swallow us whole. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking beneath me. My body didn't feel like my own, as though I was being moved by some invisible force. My fingers brushed the seat in front of me as I took a step toward the door. I didn't know why I was doing it. Part of me was screaming to turn back, to stay inside, to find some way to escape. But the other part, the part that felt so small and insignificant in this vast void, was already stepping into the unknown. I stepped off the bus. The moment my feet touched the ground, the air felt different. It was colder, heavier. The world around me was still pitch black, but I could feel it, the presence of something else. Something watching. I turned back to the bus. The door was still open, but now it felt even more like a trap. The windows were opaque, the light from inside dim and flickering. I couldn't see anyone inside anymore. The bus had become nothing more than a hollow shell, a vessel waiting to return to wherever it had come from. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't go back in. I felt a pull deep, deep inside my chest that urged me forward. I looked ahead into the infinite darkness. The air tasted metallic, like blood, and the ground beneath my feet was soft, like it was shifting. I heard a whisper. At first, it was faint, barely audible, like the wind. But then it grew louder. A voice, cold and distant, but unmistakably clear. You're not alone. I turned quickly, my heart racing. But there was nothing. No one. Just the endless dark that stretched out before me. The ground shifted beneath me again, and I stumbled. My breath hitched as I caught myself on the side of the bus, my hands pressed against the cold metal. The voice echoed once more, louder now. You never were. I whipped around, looking for the source. My mind raced, my body tense. But there was no one. No figure. No shape. Just shadows, twisting and writhing in the dark. And yet, I could feel it. Something was out there. Something was watching. My instinct screamed at me to run. To escape. To find the door and climb back into the safety of the bus. But I couldn't. The shadows, the dark, was closing in. The air was suffocating. There was no escape. I took a few steps backward, my mind spinning. Where was the bus? Where were the others? Were they still inside, or had they already disappeared? And then I heard it again. Thump. The noise was unmistakable, but it wasn't coming from behind me. It was coming from above. I looked up, The sky was no longer just black. It was alive, twisting, shifting, writhing in patterns I couldn't comprehend. Shapes moved within the dark clouds, distorted faces, eyes, hands, but they were too much to process. The shapes blurred and were formed into something monstrous, something otherworldly. And then the ground began to tremble. I couldn't breathe. It was all happening too fast, too overwhelming. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice whispered again, now inside my mind. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. There was only silence, broken by the thumping, growing louder, closer. And in that silence, I knew. This wasn't the final stop. It was only the beginning. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.